This podcast is made with the support of New Zealand On Air. A warning. Listeners should be aware this episode contains some explicit and upsetting sexual discussion, and it also includes discussion of suicide. Please take care. Episode 5. Dan. The Library of the New Zealand Law Society in Wellington is in a nondescript building directly across the road from the Beehive. Jane's flown down to Wellington from Auckland for the day. We're meeting someone who can help her, we hope, because she's got some decisions to make. After months of summoning up old griefs and sharing secrets, she's trying to move on with her life by reckoning with her past once and for all.
What I've wanted from the beginning is to talk to him and have him hear in very plain language what he did.
I'm Noelle McCarthy, and this is the final episode of Dear Jane, a podcast series from the Spinoff. We've been revisiting the years-long sexual relationship Jane had with a man we're calling Dan, the leader of her Presbyterian youth group that started when she was 14 and he was in his mid-20s. We've heard from people who were there at the time, Jane's family and her best friend Ange. We've recently reached out to Dan as well. Jane's set on having a meeting with Dan. She wants to look him in the eye and tell him how the experience has affected her. He's thinking about whether to say yes. But as someone who was a minor in a sexual relationship, she also has options for making a complaint through official channels. The thing is, we don't know which channels are best to go through. So it's time to speak to a professional.
I'm Amanda Hill, and I am a lawyer focused on the rights of people who have experienced abuse in the past or who have experienced breaches of their rights in prison.
Amanda Hill has years of experience dealing with how the law works when it comes to historic cases of sexual abuse within institutions, including churches.
There are two options for anyone in Jane's position, and the first is to go to the body and go through their process if they have one. And the second, of course, is the courts. But we'll deal with the processes, I guess, that are run by the different churches first.
Sitting across from Amanda, Jane is nodding her head.
One of the challenges that you strike first up with any of the church processes is a lack of independence. All of the processes are run by people who are associated with or work for that church. So they're effectively investigating themselves. A High Court judge said once, not directly to me, but in my hearing, that the abuser cannot be the saviour. And I think there's a lot in that, because when you're the organisation that has created the environment for this to happen, or at least is, responding to this complaint, it's very hard to suddenly change your hat and say, I'm the one that's going to make it better.
We've been in touch with the woman in charge of complaints at the church. She sent us an email outlining her process. Amanda's had a look.
One of the lines that stuck out for me in the first communication from the Presbyterian Church was, doesn't matter which system you pick or which process you pick, all roads come back to me. That was the person who runs the complaint system. All roads come back to her, and she works for the church. So, we talk about a fair hearing. How does that happen in that environment,
When the email from the church came through, Jane was overwhelmed. It was nearly 2,000 words long, with several links to various pieces of church literature, including an entire book.
While at first I thought, great, this is really thorough, I was exhausted just reading it, and I was like, I haven't even made a complaint.
One of the things the email explains is that if Jane wants to make a complaint, she'll have to be prepared for the church to pass it on to the police if they decide they need to, whether she wants that or not.
And this is already feeling like a lot of, a not very generous edit on it would be that there's a lot of self-protection potentially in place there for them.
Amanda says it's not unusual in cases of historic abuse to see complaints processes falling short in putting survivors' needs first.
Often the first question is, do you want to make a complaint? And then only later on, what do you want to see happen? Whereas for me, the first question is usually, what do you want out of this? Because you're embarking on a hard road. What does a win look like? And a win is a really, I use that term in quotes here, because there's no real winners. What does a good outcome look like?
What does a good outcome look like? That's what Jane is trying to decide.
Ultimately, I think what I've wanted from the beginning is to be able to talk to him and have him hear in very plain language what he did. Because he knows what he did. I don't think he understands the impact of what he did, and I think that in his mind he sanitized it a lot based on we were meant to be. It was God's will. We were destined, that sort of thing, right? So he, his version of events is quite different to mine. And so I want to be able to sit with him and say, this is it. And we're not talking about romance and love. We're talking about intercourse, sexual intercourse with a child, and say those words to him and have them hear them plain. As far as the church goes, I think there's some fundamental boundaries that should have been in place that probably are now in terms of, leader training and rules and regulations around what those people in those sorts of roles can't do. But it was a different time and, there was a lot of trust involved. I was never privy to the conversations that he had with them, so I don't know what he told them or how he worked the story.
Yeah.
But I'm pretty sure he wouldn't have told them that we were having sex.
Yeah. Any sane adult would have placed boundaries around that, made further inquiries, suggested that someone talk to you on your own, that, they would be natural steps.
Just breaking in here to say we'll come back to this. Quite late in the piece, we finally found someone from the church who was asked to intervene when the relationship between Dan and Jane first became known. More on that later. But for now, back to Amanda.
You said it was a different time. It was the 1990s, right? It wasn't the 1960s.
No.
It was the 90s.
Yeah.
There's a lot of knowledge around.
Yeah.
So I don't want the sort of, because they say that. A lot of perpetrators, a lot of organisations, it was a different time. It's all different now. It's not that long ago.
No.
Hey, don't shift it off into a different time because it's not that long ago.
No, I mean I've been in therapy through this process, and it's really been interesting to me that my therapist keeps picking up on the fact that I try and see things from other people's point of view all the time, and I feel that might be a little bit of a self-defense mechanism because otherwise it makes the lack of intervention worse. If I can sort of say, oh, he manipulated them as well and they were blind to it and they're in some ways victims as well, then it makes it less sad for the younger me that, someone didn't jump in and do something.
Yep.
So, this is a process for me as well, and I'm sort of trying to learn how I should and shouldn't frame things. But you're quite right. It's not that long ago. I mean, it fundamentally, if you take everything else away, what he was doing was illegal.
Yep.
So it was very clear in the law, if nothing else.
And if he hadn't been in the position he was in that position of power, in that organisation, with that access to young people, would it have happened?
Not with me. Not with me.
And so those mechanisms that were there at the time to support all of that, that's where some of that accountability has got to come from, in my view.
Yeah. I mean, I agree, and I had as a 13-year-old heading off to youth group, I didn't understand the complexities of that. I thought I was quite independent,
Yep.
And but now as a mum with a child, not far from that age, I think about the level of trust that you do put into these organisations and institutions when you send your kids off unsupervised. Yeah.
So, what does Amanda think? Can the church's complaints process provide meaningful accountability for Jane and her family?
In the current environment, unless they take themselves out of the process entirely, I can't see that happening. I think there needs to be a third party in there. You see all sorts of mediations and that sort of thing happen over time, where a third party is the one that is the go-between and is the one that gets what either party wants, or at least finds a compromise position that everyone can live with. But in this power imbalance, where you've got one person, albeit with support, and an organisation, you see the size of their complaints process. It's got chapters. How can that deliver on that level, on that human and personal level? I don't think it can.
In which case, what other options does Jane have 30 years on?
You can make a police complaint. There is no limitation period. There's no barrier to making those complaints. Other countries have, I think the phrase is a statute of limitations on some criminal offences. New Zealand does not. The barrier you might face is probably more of a culture problem. The police probably not as enthusiastic as they should be about pursuing criminal complaints from that time. Why? Yep. Workloads, evidential problems. Because, when you have a sexual assault now, you can gather DNA, you can take photos, you can use CCTV, all of those things. Usually, and this is the problem with most forms of sexual abuse, this has happened in private. You could get statements from people who knew about it at the time, and you'd probably be in a stronger evidential position than a lot of people. The police may decide that the evidence means that it might not be worth prosecuting.
That point about evidence goes right to the heart of this story, because for her own reasons, for her own peace of mind, Jane wants to hear from Dan that he knows he was wrong to have sex with her as an underage girl. But from his point of view, admitting that, especially in front of other witnesses or on a recording, that makes him more vulnerable to prosecution. And that might mean a prison term and everything that goes with it. In our phone calls, Dan has walked a line with me. He's never denied that he had sex with Jane. He hasn't contested my descriptions of him having sex with a 14-year-old. But he's never straight out admitted it either. There's a terrible irony here. I feel like Dan has, broadly speaking, been trying to engage in good faith. And he really does want to, as he puts it, help Jane heal, provided it doesn't cost him too much. And the option of getting the police involved puts Jane in a position of power. For Dan, giving Jane what she wants, a face-to-face meeting where all of this is acknowledged, that would be like putting his head into the mouth of a lion who he traumatized 30 years ago. Jane's always said to me that she wouldn't go to the police. But Dan doesn't know that. And besides, she could always change her mind. Anyway, Jane wants to ask Amanda something about the podcast too. It's been on her mind.
I've been back and forth about whether or not I use my real name in this, because I think about my children Googling my name in the future, and if it's attached to this, is possibly going to be the first thing that comes up. And I know I shouldn't be ashamed, and that if I raise my kids right, it won't be an embarrassment to them,
Yeah, I mean, I've done so much media with the Royal Commission using different names or initials. It doesn't take away from the power of the story at all. At all. There is power in telling your story in your way. And I've heard a lot of these stories, and you just use the words that you want. The law is one thing, like all these, and we can talk about, Limitation Acts and courts and processes and natural justice, and they're all really, really important because the law should be there to resolve problems and help people and provide accountability. But sometimes it doesn't. But at the end of the day, there's that human cost and the human story, and the law can't take away. Well, no, it can. The law shouldn't take away the humanity of the processes. So while I can talk about the law till the cows come home, at the end of the day, this happened, and it's had its impacts, and the law doesn't really change how you operate day to day.
No. And I think if I were to take this through the courts, and what happened is there was some sort of legal justice in the sense that he had some sort of criminal punishment coming to him. I don't know that would really make me feel any better about it. So ultimately, what's the purpose? I think that might be different if I found out it was not just me, that there was other cases like this, that I might feel a bit more strongly, because I guess I can give him some grace a little in thinking, okay, well, if I'm to believe that he really was in love, what he did was super, super wrong. There's no taking away from that. But, if this isn't a pattern of behaviour, if he's not a danger to anyone else, I don't know. It's complicated.
For now, Jane chooses not to lay a formal complaint with the church or go to the police. She still wants that meeting with Dan, though. So, over the next few weeks, I speak to Dan several times. Long conversations. Often I'm on the phone to him for half an hour or more.
Oh, hi. Nice to hear from you. Yeah, it's a good time. Yeah, I'm just at my desk.
Sometimes Dan admits, almost in passing, that what he did with Jane was wrong. But he seems to need me to understand how much he loved her and that he was committed to marrying her when she turned 18.
Okay, I'm just processing this. I guess
there are moments when he sounds, to my ear, self-justifying and kind of gross, saying that Jane was an old soul and very different to other 14-year-olds.
But she was 13 when you met her, and she was 14 when you were in a sexual relationship with her, and you were in your 20s. Can you not see the size of the power imbalance there?
But I'm also conscious that his even talking about all of this with me, a stranger, making a podcast about something that could have seismic consequences for him, there's a level of genuine engagement here. Eventually we come to an agreement. He'll meet with Jane, and both of them will have support people, but I won't come in the room, and we won't record.
But I guess that's really what we're proposing. When you go into that room with Jane, and if she brings someone else with her, then it's just you guys.
We arranged to meet at a central Auckland hotel. The place is known for its quirky, old-world decor, but we're in a room out the back of the main building, in a collection of tired-looking one-storey units. I get there early, take a flimsy wooden table from the kitchenette, put 2 chairs either side of it, and 2 bottles of water. The autumn sun is strong through the ranch slider. The room smells of air freshener, and underneath that, cigarettes. I open the windows a crack, then go down to the car park and get Dan and his support person. There's not much small talk. Once they're settled, it's time to get Jane. She's in her car. Her support person will meet us at the door to the unit. It's 10 to 10 on a Friday morning and we're sitting in your car. Very soon we're going to go into the room. How are you feeling?
I feel sick and I'm nervous. My heart was racing for most of yesterday, but I'm also glad this day has come. Yeah. I'm worried that he's going to see this as an opportunity for him to have his say, do some explaining, do some apologising. And we may get to some of that in the room. I don't know. But the parameters that I'm setting are that I'm going to be speaking. This is my chance to be heard. And it's a lot of just going to be playing it by ear once I've done that. Depending, I guess, on how he reacts.
Jane spent all the night before writing out what she wants to say to Dan. There's 6 typed pages sitting in her lap.
It's crucial that I'm able to express I've got some pretty confronting stuff to say. The shame and self-hatred I've carried has seen me sabotage. I don't know if it will break him or harden him, you know? I grieve deeply for the youth I should have had. If it will make him defensive or make him understand the true gravity of the effects of his behaviour and his decisions. Rather to confront the past and express the profound damage that has been done.
Her statement ends with 2 questions. She asks him to acknowledge having sex with her when she was 14 years old, and she asks if he's ever been with an underage person besides her.
As I wrote down everything that I wanted to say to him, I realised how much shame and guilt I still feel. Like, that really hit me last night, that I know all the things logically, I know it wasn't my fault and all that kind of stuff, but it's so embedded and it's been there for so long that it's still there. And I've been having regular therapy sessions throughout this process, and we sort of came to a point this week in therapy where it was like, yeah, I feel like I'm rotten. I feel like that it happened to me because I deserved it, because there's some part of me that's rotten. And that doesn't, when you've lived with that for a really long time, even though you may know logically, you may know that's not true, it's so deeply ingrained in me that that it's going to take a lot of work and time to change my, to change how I feel about myself, I guess, yeah. And I hope this is the beginning of that. And if it's not, that's also okay. I still need to say this stuff. This is really intense. It's going to be so full on, eh?
Anything that happens in the room's okay, you know? Anything you do, anything you say is totally okay. And if it's too much, you have the key. You can walk out. Yeah. I'll be here in the car. Okay.
He's in there?
Yeah. Now, the car is not far away from the door.
Okay.
Just so you know. This is the room. Yeah, they're in there. Is there anything you want to go through or say?
No, I just think I need to do this.
You're ready?
I'm ready.
You are. You're ready. It's taken us months to get here. And now the question is, how is Dan going to respond? Is he going to take responsibility? And there's been another question about responsibility since the start. How much of it is shared by the church? I've been trying to track down someone from the church who was there at the time, but nobody would answer my messages on social media or return phone calls, until finally, a man who helped train youth leaders, a man who used to speak at the camps Dan and Jane went to, he answered the phone. We'll call him Peter. I told Peter I wanted to talk about a youth group leader who had a relationship with a girl in his Presbyterian youth group in Auckland 30 years ago. I didn't use any names, but he immediately knew who I was talking about. He said Dan's name to me. Peter didn't want to be recorded, but he wrote out answers to my questions. He explained that he was asked to speak to Dan as a kind of mentor by Dan's mother. An elder in the church, she was worried about what was happening between Dan and Jane. Dan was likeable, Peter said, but emotionally immature. Peter said he warned Dan off Jane, told him any relationship was inappropriate because of the age difference and because Dan was her youth group leader. He says Dan replied that they were boyfriend and girlfriend. Now, you think this might have been a red flag, but there seems to have been a particular kind of innocence attributed to this in Jane's church. When I told Peter the relationship was sexual, he said he was shocked and appalled, just like Jane's sister Lisa was shocked, even though Dan and Jane had told her they were together as well. In hindsight, Peter deeply regrets leaving it with Dan after one conversation. But he felt he had good reason to believe the parish would deal with the situation. This line he wrote to me sticks out.
The 60-year-old me with many years' experience would tell the 29, 30-year-old me that yes, I should have done things differently, that I needed to ensure that the church he was responsible to was actively aware of the situation and acting in the best interest of Jane.
Peter says we do better now as a church. Each parish has a child protection officer. There's a structure wrapped around the people working in that youth space. That's all good to know. And his remorse feels genuine. But still, it jars. The way this man was so shocked by the sexual relationship, while at the same time immediately knowing who it was I was ringing about. There's an echo somehow of the awkward dance Dan and I have been doing in the lead up to this meeting today. In our conversations, he expresses regret, he acknowledges the harm he's done, he looks to the future, but all the time somehow sliding past the consequences. More than once, Dan's told me how devastated he was when Jane ended their relationship. It's like sometimes he sees himself as the victim here. If that's his mindset, I'm worried about what's going on right now in that hotel room.
Draw me closer, Lord. Fill me with your glory. It's my spirit, Lord. A brand new story. I'm forever changed through the power of your love.
About 20 minutes after Jane went into the room, she's back at the door of the car. She's crying. What happened?
I read the entire statement. But I left out the last paragraph where I thanked him for taking part, because before that were the questions.
Yeah.
And he refused to answer one of them. So I asked him straight out if he acknowledged that he had been in a sexual relationship with me from the age of 14, and he refused to acknowledge that and tried to coordinate some sort of private conversation where he could speak to that. And
What do you mean, like outside of the room?
Without other people there. And I challenged him on it several times to answer it, and he's sort of saying it's complex and all this, and I just said it's a simple question. it's clear that he's trying to protect himself. And that made me angry. And at that point, I said, this is done. He said, do you want me to speak to? And I said, no, because I said I was going to thank you for coming. That was what my next thing was. But now I don't believe that your intentions being here is as genuine as you made them out to be in terms of my healing, because I said that was what I needed to hear to heal as a validation. I know that he's protecting himself because he's concerned that by admitting anything in front of witnesses, it may come back to him in some sort of legal process. The fact of the matter is, I'd be more inclined to do that now with him not acknowledging it than if he had. If he had acknowledged it, I would have shaken his hand and wished him well. So I understand why he didn't want to. But I also don't think I should be making allowances for him at this point. I think he wants to be the good guy. I think he wants to be the guy who listens to all the things and is able to say sorry for the harm done, but without acknowledging what you did. What does that mean? What does that mean?
But you can name it. We're naming it,
Yeah.
right?
Yes, and look, I don't regret going through this process, and I am, I hesitate to say it, but I'm grateful to him that he sat in the room and listened to me. This is what I wanted. I wanted to be able to sit in a room.
Did he respond? Did he react?
He didn't visibly react. He, when I was writing it, I was like, this is going to make him cry. But there was just nothing on his face at all. And it's funny how being in a room with someone that you were once very close to in that way, I immediately felt small again, The strong voice that I planned to put on was wavering the whole time. And I think I just wanted to get out of there before he tried to spin it and before he tried to do some more PR work on it.
Did you feel like there was an intention to do that?
I think he would like me to be healed because that is good for him too, right? Because that makes this all go away. I don't know, because I guess I didn't give him the chance to talk. I'd be happy for him to write me a letter. Now that he's heard what I've had to say, he may want to respond.
I offered Dan the chance to write a letter to Jane. He thanked me and declined. Jane asked him 2 questions in the room that day. The first was, did he acknowledge having sex with her when she was 14? The second was, had he been with anyone else who was underage? Dan told me on the phone, as he said to Jane in the room, he absolutely has never been with another underage person. Dan wouldn't write Jane a letter, but in the end we did get one from the church. I asked the Presbyterian Church for comment, and the Assembly Executive Secretary, Reverend Wayne Matheson, wrote back. He said that while they couldn't make a full investigation without a formal complaint,
I am saddened by how let down this former youth group member was as a youth in our church, and I am concerned for their well-being today. What you describe is a very inappropriate relationship that should not have begun, been encouraged, nor allowed to continue. It is the adult youth leader who must uphold the boundaries of the youth leader relationship. This relationship is spiritual in nature. A sexual relationship is an abuse of power and influence, a betrayal of trust. Although decades have passed, we do not accept that things were different 30 years ago. While our church did not have the strong and robust policies around working with children and youth that it has today, both back then and today, a youth leader engaging in a sexual relationship with a teenage youth group member is abhorrent.
Reverend Matheson ends the letter by hoping that I'll encourage Jane to make a formal complaint so that he can carry out a thorough investigation and find out how it happened. So where does all of this leave Jane? 3 months after her meeting with Dan, we catch up. How are you feeling?
I'm pretty good. I'm happy to say I'm pretty good. Yeah. It was a huge thing that was really hard at the time. And if I sit in it too long, still can be a little bit hard, but I'm able to not sit in it, the way that I have been over the years. Yeah. Even though this will never go away, it won't be, it's not a silver bullet talking to him, it's not a cure-all, but it is, I felt a lot of relief in the days following. I felt like a big burden had been lifted. It had been something that I'd been wanting to do for so long, and it was done, and he received it, and it felt freeing, and I felt like I'd been really strong, and I was really proud of myself for advocating for myself in that way.
I mean, we've shared the email that we've received from the head of the Presbyterian Church. Do you feel like you need to take this further?
First of all, I'm really encouraged by the response. There was no sort of skirting around it, making excuses, particularly when he said, times, I don't accept that times were different back then, it's still abhorrent. Like, that was very, very validating for me. But there is still a tension for me in the fact that the institution in which this happened would be responsible for investigating it. But also just they have this thing where they can take it to the police whether you want to or not.
And am I right in thinking you don't want to do that?
I'm not at that point, and I don't imagine I'm going to get to that point, to be honest, because I feel better about things than I did. So if I wasn't going to do it 6 months ago, I'm not going to do it now. It would take something probably from him coming out and denying it, or finding out that there had been someone else, which I truly don't think is the case. So I'm not going to be making a complaint because I feel like it would be potentially taken out of my hands, and I've worked so hard to get my power back at this point that I don't really want to do that right now. Yeah.
So there's no neat bow to wrap around this ending. Life goes on. If nothing else, at least now, Jane and her family will be able to talk more about what happened with Dan and how it's affected Jane.
It's been really, a huge part of the process for me to be able to talk so openly with you and with Ange and with my mum and my sister. And I think if we hadn't made this podcast, I probably wouldn't have had those conversations. And they're really, really important conversations to have.
I'd like to think this has been a positive process, but Jane's the only one who can answer that.
The whole reason I've been able to go through this process of beginning to heal is because I read someone else's story, and that was the first time about 6 years ago that I thought, oh my gosh, maybe it's not my fault. Maybe I wasn't complicit. Maybe I'm actually not responsible for this at all. And that started a chain of events where I was able to then open up to my family and to some very trusted friends and bring it up to a counsellor and that kind of thing. And then, the more, as the years went on and the more I saw it for what it was, then I had this almost a feeling of responsibility to share my story in the hope that it could help others the same way that I was helped by this very brave woman who told her story that I read. And it's a bonus that I've been able to do so much processing as part of that. I've been incredibly lucky to have this support around me that's come with doing this, and I've felt very held all the way through. Like, I'm so grateful to you, Noelle, and to all the crew who've worked on it, because it has put me in a really privileged position in terms of just feeling really supported and heard and believed. But even if listening to this helps someone to know that something has happened to them is not their fault and just starts a positive process for them in that way, like, we've done what we set out to achieve.
And part of doing this process for me hasn't just been meeting 44-year-old Jane, it's also meeting 14-year-old Jane. And I feel like she was there with us, because it's very rare you have these letters, which, you know, introduced me to you. I felt like I knew you. And I guess at the end of this process now, this is the last thing we'll do. When you think about your 14-year-old self, Jane, when you think about yourself as you were then, what would you, what would you say to her?
There's such a duality to that question because, you know, when I think back to that girl, she was had the whole world ahead, you know, had a great family, great friends, and what should have been just a regular teenagehood. But I also would tell her that she's smart and funny and kind, and remind her that she has the whole world ahead of her, and hopefully that would put her in a position to, I was about to say to not fall into something like this, but it wasn't my fault. So I'd still tell her those things. She's smart, she's funny, she's kind, she's strong. But at the end of the day, it wasn't my fault.
If you would like to read the full statement Jane read out to Dan in this episode of Dear Jane, you can see it on the spinoff.co.nz. If this series brings up any issues for you, there is help available 24/7 on Helpline. Free call or text 1737. And for more resources, you can visit the show notes for this episode of Dear Jane. Dear Jane is a Spinoff podcast network production, written and produced by me, Noelle McCarthy. Thank you to everyone who spoke to us for this series. Our producer is Madeline Walker. Our executive producer is Toby Manhire. Story consultants are Alex Casey and John Daniel. Our sound recordist is Te Butler. Additional studio recording by Samuel Robinson. Our sound design and mix is by Mark Chesterman. Our original theme music is by Te Butler. Our graphic designers are Tina Tiller and Archie Banal. Our voice actors are Liv Tennant and Tom Clark. And special thanks to Kirsty Johnston for guidance on trauma-informed reporting. This series was made possible by support from New Zealand On Air.